only showing me on there, and I think it just wasn't going through right. Okay, let's see. It says we're going live on YouTube again. I think we tried this just a moment ago, and I think I messed it up and it did not work right. So hopefully we are up there now. So apologies, those on Zoom get to hear me say this one more time, but I'll be quick. Those that are on YouTube, welcome. Thank you for joining us, whether you're watching us this live or watching sometime later in the week. If you are live, please join in the comments. You just type there in the chat and we will bring those in the conversation. We're glad that you're with us. And also wanted to say that this will be our last Bible study session for a little while, and then we are going to take a break for the summer months and have more time for in-person fellowship, and then we will be back together again in some form in the fall. But this will be our last Bible study session for a while now. So thank you for joining us, and we are now going to turn our attention to the Book of Ruth. All right, thank you, YouTube or Zoom folks, for listening through that all again.
Barbara just ducked her head in my office, say, it's not on YouTube. I said, I should be now. Will has fixed it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and share our screen here with the passage for today. So we're in this last little section of Ruth, starting at verse 13 and reading through the end of the Book of Ruth, verse 22. Would anyone like to go ahead and read that for us? And remember, the key to saying biblical names correctly is saying them with confidence as if you know what you're saying.
Okay, I can read it with that vote of confidence. Starting from 13, right?
Yes.
Okay. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nation, Nation of Salmon, and Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David.
Thank you. I'm going to leave this up for just a moment as we take note of a couple of things. So the child who is born to Ruth and Boaz is a descendant of Perez, and this is important because we made reference early in the Book of Ruth back to the book of Genesis. Perez is the child that was born to Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar, and was a very similar situation, the son of a deceased son in this case. And so there's a legacy of this that's being established. But what other things stick out to you as you look at these verses about how this story ends? What is it about Ruth and Naomi and the women of this town who are speaking to them? What strikes you about these verses?
Wasn't it unusual for them to name the child?
Certainly. Mm-hmm. It would be very unusual for the women to be the one who choose the name.
And for Naomi to nurse him?
Good catch. Yes.
I'm gonna get that one.
I mean, that's a weird thing, right? Like, Naomi is old, right, according to her own words. And it says here that Naomi laid the child against her bosom and was his nurse. And that is the word for breastfeeding. So there is just all kinds of layers of miraculous events happening here.
Well, and it says, that blessed be the Lord, and he shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. And we talked about how Naomi had kind of felt like her life was basically, for a time anyway, her life was basically over and everything. And now this is kind of, it's like, no, your life's not over. It's in some ways just starting again in a very new and exciting way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the story really does circle back to Naomi, where Ruth had been taking charge, and Ruth has this child, and then she just kind of disappears here, and now Naomi has this child. Yes, Ruth was helped, I guess, but Naomi has a child now. It's sort of the way the story ends, and that's from Ruth's perspective, that's kind of odd. But from, I guess, if Naomi is sort of at the heart of this story from the beginning, as sort of seeing it from her perspective, she. It's a happy ending for her, I guess, as it were, in that it is not an ending. It is a continuation where she thought there was an ending. Yeah, as well said.
Anything else that sticks out about these?
Well, the fact that they say a son has been born to Naomi, I guess everybody maybe in the community would know her better than Ruth. But yeah, it's like Will said, Ruth's kind of, okay, you had a baby. Now, that's thanks. But hopefully, I'm assuming that their relationship, continued going forward and is stronger than ever.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I never realized, well, I guess I maybe realized I forgot that this son would then be, basically grandfather or great-great-grandfather of David.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when we had kids and people congratulated me on having a child or whatever, and Aaron says, I'm the one that did all the work over here. Yeah, there is a sort of bit of Naomi has a son, and I can imagine Ruth going, I'm the one that did all the work here. It was my life that was at risk, and this is there are no hospitals here, right? This is a dangerous thing, childbirth, and so. Yeah, but I guess we have to read that in the context of the rest of this story, where we saw Ruth and Naomi becoming so close that they are, before this child was born, they had become family to each other, and they had traveled together and committed to each other, really, that they were taking care of each other. And so this child that is born is not just Ruth's son, it is also Naomi's son. And so that, that feels like kind of a beautiful part of the story too.
Do we know if Ruth and Boaz had any other children?
No. Which is pretty common. I mean, once you have your firstborn son, nobody else really matters that much.
Yeah, this is the only place we hear about it, really. So
But it is interesting then that when we're looking at this, we get to the book of Matthew, and in the genealogy of Jesus, you're going through, and it does list some of the women of this genealogy of Jesus. And it says Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. And it names Ruth. It doesn't name Naomi in this later genealogy. And Ruth is there alongside of the other women who are named Tamar, the mother of Perez. Same type of situation as Ruth is in, with being the one to provide an heir. And then she's called the wife of Uriah, but Bathsheba is listed in this genealogy. And so all of the women that are listed in this genealogy here in Matthew 1 are a little bit scandalous for the most part. So there's some level of interest and intrigue and not who you think it's going to be about the way that they have their children.
Yeah. And I'll bring in a comment from on YouTube. Barbara Moore says that maybe it was important to prolong the line from Bethlehem. And so I think part of the story is telling about that, well, how the line is prolonged for sure. And Bethlehem being a significant piece of this that, of course, comes up in the genealogy of Jesus as well, right? And she says that it seems like much is about symbolism more than literalism. And I think that's a great point, the symbolism of this is really important and is a big part of why the story is told the way it is. This is not a story that we can really corroborate in any way to say this is historical or not historical. I mean, how would one go about that? And so we have this story as it is, and part of what we look at is we have these 4 chapters. So that is this story. It is a pretty tightly composed story. I mean, it is a well-crafted narrative that starts with Naomi and you see her life sort of falling apart, and it ends here and with these verses we read today of how her life has this renewed hope, and she has found this community that supports her and a child and a future and all of this. It is a beautifully told story, and I think there is a lot of symbolism in how this story is told and which details are included. And so it would be next to impossible to answer the historicity question. You know, what historically happened? How could we possibly know? But what we can know is how the story is told and what is the meaning that the authors are telling in this story. And so I think often that is a more interesting question than the what happened historically question that you could argue about, but no one's going to win that argument. But it is interesting, which things are told here in which ways, and what does that mean, and why was this story be told? Why is it significant that this story be kept? I probably landed on a part of that with giving this genealogy and the connection to so David and ultimately Jesus, and that's this sort of gives some backstory in that genealogy. But it is interesting to think why this story of all the lives of all the people in Israel. They all had a story, but this one was worth writing down and worth becoming part of Scripture. And that's an interesting question to think about.
Well, I mean, when you think about all that had to happen in order for Ruth to end up being the mother of Obed, who, and basically the grandmother of David, to continue that line. I mean, what happens if that doesn't happen? What happened if Ruth says, I'm not coming back with you, Naomi. I'm going to stay in Moab because this is where I know everybody. What happens? I mean, does the line just stop? So it kind of is a miraculous story if you think about it.
And you also wonder how is some of this almost a little bit of a political propaganda kind of a thing, in that David becomes king of Israel, and then the people of Israel reflect back on his history and his family line. And I think of the way that right now we're in this very present moment of cancel culture, and someone who's in the public eye, you find something that they posted or tweeted or whatever 10 years ago, and all of a sudden everyone hates them and wants to write them off completely, and there's no good in them ever. And in the life after David's life, is there some level of, well, is he really a legitimate king? He has a Moabite in his background. He's got Moabite blood in his family line. And this is a little bit of an explanation of, no, this is fine. We accept people into our community, and Ruth became a full part of the community through this commitment of, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And so in some ways, David's role is just as important to this story being written down as Naomi is to this story being written down.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess the thing that appealed to me the most is also how applicable this story is, even to our current, just living our lives currently. And I think it has to do with because oftentimes, right now, we experience grief, we experience fear, and very legitimately so, but they can also cripple us, and almost in the beginning, right? It almost crippled Naomi. She was about to give up. And I think that, it took essentially like a leap of faith into the unknown, and they just kind of had to do the next right thing from Frozen. Out of love, Ruth was out of love for her mother-in-law. And perhaps Naomi agreed to it. We didn't really hear that part of it, out of respect for her daughter-in-law. Maybe she felt like, well, I'm going to do, this feels like it's the right thing. And then in the end, the product of having taken that leap of faith out of love, produced something greater than they could both, that they couldn't have imagined in the beginning, right? In the beginning of the story, they could not have imagined. And I think it was miraculous, like what Larry was saying, that it was, God had his hands in it, right? And because they were doing the right things, even though it was probably scary and, maybe irrational, maybe a little bit crazy, but it was for the right reasons. It was for loving reasons that it all worked out. And actually at the end, there was, the woman they were telling Naomi, like, the way I read it, it was almost like they were like, see, everything's, it all worked out, like, yeah, you're okay, right? They were like, look, so that was what I got out of it.
Yeah, that's great. And isn't it remarkable that we see God in this story? I mean, we see it as a deeply theological story in many ways, and yet it's not a story where we have God as an active character throughout, saying, and then God told them in a dream that they should go to this country, and then God said, go do this, and the word of the Lord came to me saying that. It doesn't come across that way. Usually when God's mentioned here, it's why would God allow something like this? God is sort of, the hand of the Lord is against me in the early parts of this book. And yet what we see in the story is the way that God is at work in the long arc of this story, not as the character manipulating each thing, sort of actively and visibly, but deeply involved throughout the book. And so I think that's another part that feels sort of applicable when we don't have God speaking to us in a vision, telling us what to do next, and yet we can look back on our lives in broad strokes and see the ways God was involved.
Well, let's continue with that theme of broad strokes a little bit. So we talked at the beginning of this study about how the Book of Ruth is used in Jewish tradition. It's read at the Feast of the Harvest at Shavuot. But over the generations, this Feast of the Harvest also becomes a celebration of when Torah was given to the people at Mount Sinai. And so you're reading most of the Torah, most of the first 5 books of the Bible are read over the course of this week-long celebration, and the Book of Ruth alongside of it. So I found an interesting article that was written by a biblical scholar and a rabbi together, and I will go ahead and I'll just put the link to this online article in our chat box here, and then maybe Will, you can copy it over to YouTube for folks. If you want to read the whole thing, it was all very, very interesting, but just some highlights from this. Will and I were talking this week about the return back to the place of Israel, and the way that this is a very a place-centered story, which then brings to mind Ezra Nehemiah. And I know if we dig back through the file folders of our minds, that our Bible study last summer talked through Ezra Nehemiah as well. And so how do we read these two stories in connection with and alongside of one another? They're both very likely added to the Jewish canon around the same period of time, but they say very vastly different things. Ezra and Nehemiah both have these accounts of sending away the foreign wives. Ezra 9 talks about the people of Israel all coming together in the big assembly and saying, we've sinned against God by taking these foreign wives and having their children, and we have to send them all away. And in Nehemiah 13, he actually talks about beating the men who have taken wives and beating the wives of men who are foreign women. And it's tragic and it's scary because of the way that we think through what are a woman's options when she no longer has a husband to protect her, and how many women are being sent away by Ezra and Nehemiah into possible destruction and death. And that's hard to imagine, wanting to purify your group of people so much. But then you have this story of Ruth, where it's all about bringing in the outsider and the outsider becoming a part of the community. And one of the things that this article I just need linked to mentions is that this is the whole point of Jewish rabbinic discussion and teaching. You know, in Christianity, we tend to seek an answer and want one answer and find the meaning of a story and stick with that one meaning. But when Jewish rabbis are teaching and talking, there's always room for questions. They said in this article, there's always an alternative position and perspective to consider. The point is that nothing, even when it's explicit, as Torah law cites in Deuteronomy, nothing is off limits to questioning. And so we look at these examples of Ezra and Nehemiah versus the example of Ruth, and we think through them side by side. And so there are these examples of, you know, there's this foreign presence that could lead us astray, and we don't want to allow that to happen. But there's this foreign woman who becomes a part of the community and does great things to help in the restoration of this people, or even just one person's life. And we want that to be upheld. So then how do we hold these things in tension as part of the same body of work? They're both part of the Old Testament. They're both part of what we call Holy Scripture. How do you think about that tension of difference?
Actually, that reminds me of something that I read, maybe in like a parenting book, but it said that, you know, like one of the features of whether you can be an adult is whether you can hold two different contradicting things in your mind at the same time. And yeah, because, you know, real life is complicated and there are pros and cons. And I feel like we tend to want to see things in black and white, you know, and maybe that's what causes the cancel culture is, oh, either a person is all good or they're all bad, you know? And so there's that label that occurs, but people aren't like that, right? People are nuanced and complicated and they make mistakes. And so, and it's hard sometimes to kind of be at peace with seemingly contradictory, you know, and opposites, right? So, but I guess that's part of being an adult.
Yeah. And that's the truth of the Bible, right? Like, that's why it's so hard sometimes to teach kids certain Bible stories, is because the Bible does not offer us quick and easy answers. And the Bible doesn't even give us one single authorized perspective on everything that we're trying to work through. The Bible, more than anything, raises more questions for us in the, how do I apply this? How do I interpret this? What do I do with this?
Yeah, Barbara Moore in the conversation in the chat made a connection to the Book of Acts, where being a believer makes us a legitimate part of God's family, and sees a connection to this story of Ruth, where sort of Ruth's commitment of faith, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God, and she becomes part of the community, and so I appreciate Barbara for pointing us to Acts, where the same kind of thing is happening in the early church, of deciding, how are we going to be a people of faith? What are we as a Christian community? And you can imagine this group, and you see it in Acts, sort of this wrestling of, who are we? We are, and trying to define that, and defining who you are does require kind of drawing some walls around yourself, and, you know, not physical walls, but saying, this is who we are. No, this is who we are. And yet also it's constantly pushing out, because the story of Acts is going out and bringing new people into it, and that is complicated because you know, that in some ways the Ezra Nehemiah kind of perspective of you bring in all these outsiders, they're going to change things. Well, that is partly true. There's some truth to that as the church grows and expands and brings in Gentiles, and it changes the character of it. And so there's a lot of, you see that tension, I think, play out in Acts. And of course we feel that in our lives today too, right? As a nation, also as a church. I think a lot of churches have, people talk about church growth, and when that means something changes because different people come in and maybe they have different preferences or traditions, or growth means change. And so I think this is an eternal question that we're wrestling with, that we see playing out there in Ezra Nehemiah versus Ruth. I think it's just part of our lives, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think it really points toward the fact that integration into the community is key. You know, we don't baptize people and then say, see you at Christmas. You know,
or Easter.
Sometimes we do, if we're really being honest. But the hope is that you integrate people into the life that you're living together. So, you know, the folks who aren't necessarily here on Sunday morning, but that do show up and play softball with us on Friday nights, they're a part of the life of our church. And the hope would be then that we integrate more of the life of our church into their lives. Or that, you know, those who show up on Sunday morning, but that don't come play softball and miss out on the fun of that, get to be integrated into the fun of that as well. And so trying to merge the different parts of our lives together. And, you know, I think about the hope that I have for wanting to do college ministry in this town, and why we're, you know, redoing a room for college students and creating space for them in our building, is because that's how we're going to integrate them into the life of our church and integrate them into all of what we're doing throughout the week, and not just at one particular moment of the week.
Right.
I see that sadly we're getting to the 10:30 time, and so maybe this is a good place to sort of open up for any final thoughts about this book, or reading this book in this moment. I think it's a timely book in some ways, right? Being the story of a book that opens with grief and loss and separation and being in a strange place and traveling to another place, and all that sense of dislocation that we've in various ways related to this year, senses of loss and grief and dislocation, and yet the story ends with hope and integration into a new family and a new community and coming together, and that renewed life, and that I feel like is really speaks to this moment that we're in. But do you all have any kind of final closing thoughts or observations or hopes coming out of this book?
Just one really quick one. So there was a speaker a few years ago who came and gave, you know, the part of the lecture series, I forget. And somebody asked him a question, you know, what is the meaning of church? And he said that it is where people go to tell each other the truth. Maybe that's a summary, but maybe that's not the exact wording. And it got me thinking, you know, from what Val was saying on this discussion, is that, I mean, maybe the thing to do is, you know, like we all have our own truths, right? And then we tell it to each other and then trust God to do the rest and put our faith in God. And I feel like that's basically what Ruth and Naomi did in the book, is they told the truth and then they trusted God. Or maybe, you know, I don't know if they felt it, but in the end, I think because they did that, it worked out.
I think that is a wonderful closing thought for this study. Well, I will see all of you in just a few moments who are here on Zoom. Most of you who are already in the building. Jackie, I'm guessing we will see you very shortly. And everyone who's with us on YouTube, thank you for being with us for this series and for all of the work that we have done together, for participating in the ways you have over the past months as we've gone through Ruth and James, and all of these things that we've discussed together have really been enjoyable.
And so we're still going to be worshiping online. Our worship service will still be broadcast for sure, and we'll see what we come up with in the fall as we decide what Bible study looks like. But for now, we'll shift toward in-person options for fellowship and continue to have worship in person and wherever we are. So yes, thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you one way or another.
Thank you, Val.
Thank you.